a coded gay woman is killed because she'd rather have pussy than Bond. Hello, welcome back to Marathon Man, where I'm going through the history of James Bond, looking at the novels and the films in release order, as well as doing pit stops along the way to take a look at various media that might have come out in between. And you join me at Ian Fleming's 7th James Bond novel, Goldfinger. After going big for Dr. No, it really wouldn't have worked for Fleming to have repeated himself so soon here. And I said in my video about Dr. No that its excesses kind of worked because there was a feeling of the series building up to it. But another reason why those excesses worked is because the series doesn't always go for them. So it's a smart move for Goldfinger to tone it back down a little bit, which isn't to say that Goldfinger is a smaller story, not by any means. Goldfinger is just as big a villain as Dr. No. It's just that, like Drax, he lives out in the open rather than on his own private secret island. He has the same resources as Dr. No, but with Bond coming up against him in Miami, Kent, Switzerland and Kentucky, it all happens in really relatable locations. There's no jungles or giant squids here. So I mentioned Drax because not only do I think that Auric Goldfinger is broadly of the same type of villain as Drax, but also the book itself kind of all of the adventures so far, hews closest to Moonraker. A wealthy, self-made man of nebulous origins is up to no good, and a high-up civil servant spots it and needs Bond to go after him. And as such, Goldfinger does kind of a little bit pale in comparison. The book, not the character. The character is larger than life and is concocted with exactly the same type of contempt that Fleming reserves for his villains, and so he emerges as quite a strong antagonist. Part of this might be because Fleming named him after an architect who he really didn't like, so perhaps channeling some of that contempt into the fictional counterpart wasn't that hard to do. Something I really like is that Erno Goldfinger discovered that his name was going to be used and so threatened to sue, but the book had already been printed and was about to be released. So Fleming said alright, but he was going to change the name to Goldprick, with an author's note explaining exactly why. The matter was settled out of court. But as well drawn as Auric Goldfinger is, the book he's in doesn't quite manage to live up to Moonraker in several respects. Now, I only keep referencing Moonraker, not because I think that Goldfinger has copied it completely. I just think that they occupy the same space when it comes to different types of Bond adventure. But there are enough differences that Goldfinger definitely emerges as its own book. So, for example, Bond comes across the villain himself before being instructed to go after him, and he takes it upon himself to thwart him while off duty. And not to mention the pace of this one is it's much more slowly catchy monkey than Moonraker's incredibly brisk pace. So they do emerge as very different stories. It's just that I think that this one has the most in common with Moonraker out of all of the previous adventures so far, and so what that means is I find it really hard not to draw comparisons between them. So following the enormity of Dr. No, Goldfinger's return to, for want of a better term, the real world, brings with it a couple of changes to Bond's character. So I detect him as way more cocky here, and therefore a touch more reckless as a result. Now, that could be put down to the fact that he'd survived the ordeal in the previous book, and that's sort of given him a bit of a complex. But Fleming's quite clever in that yes, that is a valid reading, but it could also just be out of pure contempt for Goldfinger. And I'd buy either reading, it's just that the first one serves to give this book a place in the ongoing series and therefore feel like an evolution. The character of Bond is changing as we go on, rather than just standing still and becoming an empty vessel to be thrown into whichever adventure his creator thinks up. And it makes for an entertaining guide through the story as well. Bond's sheer determination to bring down Goldfinger, as much out of dislike for the man as out of duty, drives this plot forward, and it serves to make us root for Bond more and more, while at the same time and proportionately making us loathe Goldfinger more and more. So by the time we reach the enaction of Goldfinger's scheme at the end, the need to defeat him doesn't just come out of heroism, but it feels like it almost comes out of spite as well. And that's something that Fleming has made the reader complicit in. And that makes for a complicated knot of emotions at the end, which is a deft move. But obviously heroism does play a part. It's not to say that the stakes are swept under the carpet solely in favour of a personal grudge. When it becomes apparent that thousands of lives are at stake, Bond is horrified and more than a little desperate. That definitely takes place over his cumulative rivalry with Goldfinger. But that cumulative rivalry with Goldfinger is never truly forgotten either. Because the antagonism between Bond and Goldfinger is a driving force in this story. We begin with Bond remembering the mission that he's just finished, which was loosely adapted by the film for its pre-credit sequence. And I quite like the fact that because that pre-credit sequence has no bearing on the plot of the film whatsoever, even that loose tradition of a pre-credit sequence that's largely removed from the plot of the main film, even that comes from Fleming. He's interrupted by a character who was present at the card game against Le Chiffre in Casino Royale, and as Bond is delayed overnight in Miami, he's got to wait until the next day before he can leave. This character asks Bond to help him prove that the man he plays cards against is cheating, and that man is Goldfinger. And so Bond does, humiliating Goldfinger. From there, they also have a golf match where once again Bond trumps Goldfinger, and then he tracks him to his factory in Switzerland. So each time the men meet, the tension between them rises, and as each of them has to maintain this veneer of gentlemanly politeness, the nausea at having to do so is kind of palpable. It's easily the most successful part of the book, and included in that is the excellently described game of golf. And it makes for one of the more interesting relationships between Bond and villain in the book series so far, perhaps even since Le Chiffre. But while this is a central thrust of the book, and an excellent one, things begin to fall apart in this one in a way quite unlike any of the other stories up until this point. And it's to do with how the book is constructed. At one point, Goldfinger tells Bond in an excellent line for a Bond villain, "Mr. Bond, they have a saying in Chicago. Once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, the third time it's enemy action." And the book is split into three parts: happenstance, coincidence, and enemy action. And it's a really neat way of delineating the encounters between Bond and Goldfinger, as well as, if you think about it, kind of divvying the book up into a 3-act structure. However, there isn't the rigidity that that structure implies, and despite a theoretical delineation, the threads kind of get messy. So, for example, there are 3 love interests in this story. The first one, Jill Masterson, is introduced in the first part of the book. The second, Jill's sister Tilly, is introduced in the second part of the book, and Pussy Galore is introduced in the third part of the book. But Tilly crosses over from the second into the third, and Pussy is basically introduced as a tertiary villain. She's the leader of one of the criminal gangs that Goldfinger is trying to entice into his scheme, and with Tilly at Goldfinger's mercy alongside Bond for, quite a chunk of the book, then I guess it stands to reason to call Tilly the female lead. Now, if you've seen the film, then you know that Tilly doesn't make it to the end. But her counterpart in the book does last quite a bit longer, at least until the raid on Fort Knox. And when she is dispatched in the ensuing fight, it's quite late for her to exit the book. And so her death does have an impact on Bond, because he's just lost the female lead. But following the scuppering of Goldfinger's plan, there comes a kind of bolted-on coda, kind of like insipid encore, which can't quite end things on a bang, because it's as if it's forgotten that it's already played all the hits. What doesn't help is that Pussy Galore, tough lesbian gangster, inexplicably switches sides and falls for Bond. This comes out of nowhere and isn't adequately explained at all. Now, obviously there's the wish fulfillment of an alpha male turning a gay woman, but honestly, that's literally all there is. So it's incredibly dubious as an intent on the part of the writer, but also as an artistic choice, it makes very little sense. It adds nothing to the book. It's as if Fleming has realised, oh, I've killed Tilly now. Bond's going to end the book without a woman. So what? The ending of Moonraker had Gala Brand announce that she was engaged to another man and go off with him, leaving Bond feeling a little bit silly. Now, that didn't diminish the book or the character. In fact, actually, it humanised and complicated him. So not to have the courage to end similarly here, or just keep Tilly alive until the end, is quite a big misstep. And Tilly is very taken with Pussy as well, meaning there's a more than implied queerness there. Pussy is overtly and explicitly stated as a lesbian, but Tilly isn't. I mean, even though that is the intention, she could easily be bi. So this way, Fleming could have still ended the book with a romantic twist between Bond and a woman who likes women. So he could have got his little forbidden fruit kicks without it being as morally or narratively questionable. But to be honest, that's a suggestion as a concession. It's not even how I wanted the book to end. Even with Tilly alive, at the end, she needn't go off with Bond. I mean, that, like I said, that's how Moonraker ended, and it didn't have us screaming sissy at the last page because Bond didn't get the girl. For me, a better ending would have been to keep Tilly alive and let her go off with Pussy. Euphemism very much Fleming's, by the way. He knew what he was doing. And that, rather distastefully, feeds into Tilly's exit in the book. Put simply, a coded gay woman is killed because she'd rather have Pussy than Bond. Which highlights another aspect, and it might imply an agenda at work here, because this is quite easily Fleming's most homophobic work since the series began. Not just in the idea of Bond curing Pussy, which, by the way, isn't even in keeping with the character of the Bond in the books anyway, as far as I'm concerned. Like I said earlier, Gala Brand wouldn't leave her fiancé for him, but a rock-hard lesbian gangster will suddenly turn hetero. But also in some pretty unpleasant passages where Fleming sort of has Bond pontificate on homosexuals in general. It's a shame, not just because it's ignorant, but also because it just has no place in the book whatsoever. And some people might go, oh, is this why you didn't enjoy the book? Yeah, it's a factor, but it isn't the only reason. Basically, what I think is, I've detected a book where the plot severely falls off a cliff, narratively speaking. And I think what this means is, I think there's a distinction between an Ian Fleming who isn't trying very hard and an Ian Fleming who is letting baser impulses get the better of him. And so they both combine, and they both end up being present in the book. A Fleming who isn't trying very hard, and also some quite unpleasant passages. Because it also happens to be Fleming's most racist work since the series began as well. Live and Let Die's depictions of black Americans and subservient characters like Quarrel haven't exactly been great bastions of progressiveness, but they could kindly be read as an upper-class white toff's idea of people of colour, rather than being deliberately hateful. But Fleming's and Bond's utter contempt for Koreans here is filled with actual bile, and it leaves a very nasty taste as a result. It isn't a huge part of the book, but it's enough to leave a dent. And honestly, at times, it just feels like Fleming wasn't able to stop himself by going, and another thing about Koreans. So alongside the end of the book, which falls apart narratively even without the problematic overtones, this results in the most polarised entry in the series so far. The strong elements are incredibly strong, up there with the strongest elements of the canon so far. So, for example, the golf match or Bond's tailing of Goldfinger across France are written with such command that the chase, while slow, remains engrossing. And the characters are well drawn as well, with Goldfinger being quite deserving of taking his place in the pantheon of great Bond villains. But the lesser elements really do let this one down. But because the stronger stuff is so strong, and I think the plot itself is superior, then I sort of place this one above Live and Let Die and Diamonds Are Forever, even though I'd probably say those are more consistent pieces of work. Goldfinger simultaneously contains some of the most beautiful and some of the most ugly Bond work yet. It's therefore never a boring read, but it is an unusual one, and sometimes even quite challenging. Auric Goldfinger really does feel like the most well-drawn Bond villain for a good few books, and his cheating at golf is boo-hiss-worthy, and his being hoist by his own petard is punch-the-air satisfying. What Fleming was thinking about how he ended this book, I do not know, but it turns the whole thing into soup, and not tasty soup. Again, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed golfing with Goldfinger, then you know how YouTube works. Please do let me know by hitting that like and spreading the word. It'd be great to get as many Bond fans along for the Supermarathon ride as possible. And what do you think of this one? Is it a game of two halves, or does it hang together better for you than it does for me? Is Pussy Galore changing sides like that way too jarring a way to end the book, or does that sort of thing not matter to you as long as Bond gets his end away? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you back here soon for some Murder on Motorbike. So if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button, bong the bell, and I'll see you in France.